Good day and a very warm welcome to the UNAIDS South Africa podcast with myself, Zinat Abdul. As June marks Pride Month across the globe, we are reminded that there is much to celebrate, especially since 123 countries have decriminalized or do not penalize same sex relations. While this is a positive and a move in the right direction, UNAIDS Executive Director Winnie Byanyima says there remains a concern that the human rights of the LGBTIQ community remains threatened by a globally coordinated and well-funded extremist anti-rights network who are spending millions promoting hate and social division and are proposing ever more draconian laws to punish LGBTQI people. Attacks on this community violate human rights and undermine public health. In addition to criminalization, the LGBTIQ community continues to face stigma and discrimination in workplaces, social environments, healthcare, and education facilities, including the playground. Today, we are featuring an inspirational transgender activist in South Africa, Zoey Black. Zoey shares her lived experience from coming out as transgender in 2019 to creating a YouTube channel, which is the first of its kind in South Africa, helping people who are struggling on their journey to create a community with information on transgender rights, medical advice and views on hormone replacement therapy, mental health, and so much more. As an activist, Zoey publicly advocates for trans rights and visibility, engaging organizations and government stakeholders to activate social change and law reform. She's also a published author and editor, contributing most notably to the book called They Called Me Queer, published in 2019, Trans Rural Narratives, published in 2020, and Keeping the Promise of Dignity and Freedom for All, also published in the year 2020. Zoey, it is an absolute honor and privilege to be able to speak with you today. A very warm welcome to the UNAIDS podcast, and I hope you're doing great today. Perhaps the first thing we could start off is by asking you, tell us a little bit more. Who exactly is Zoey Black?
Hi, thanks for having me. This is really, really great. My name is Zoey Black. I am a queer trans woman living in Cape Town. I am a filmmaker. I'm a photographer, a creative director. There's a lot of work that I've been doing around sort of visual work, narrative work, for queer and trans people in South Africa, globally as well. And so that's sort of like my area of focus. So now I'm here on the podcast chatting to you, which is amazing.
Wonderful. I mean, maybe perhaps, it is so apt. We're actually talking to you. We've just commemorated ABIT, which is the International Day Against Homophobia, Biphobia, and Transphobia. And currently, at this point, we're talking to you in June 2024, and it is the start of what we call Pride Month. As a transgender and queer activist, can you share with us your journey to becoming a transgender woman and a queer activist?
So for me, I came out pretty late in my life. I remember where I was. It's a very vivid thing that's burned into my memory forever. I was in the bath one day, and my partner and I were living together, and I was scrolling on YouTube, and I found this channel that was run by what she termed as a gender therapist. Right? I think she was doing her master's in gender affirming therapy. And so as part of her thesis, she was pushing these videos on YouTube. And one of them was a series around, are you trans? Do you think you might be transgender? So I watched this video. As it comes up on YouTube. They send you these random things every now and then that pops up on your feed.
Yeah.
And I go, that looks interesting. And I click the video and I watch it. And she proceeds to ask these questions about how you feel about your identity, how do you see yourself in the mirror, how are other people engaging with you, how are you feeling about that? And so she goes on this list of questions that she proceeds to ask. And then she goes, well, look, if you've answered yes to many or some of these questions, there might be a possibility that you might be trans. And I was like, what? So I watched the next video and the next video and the next video and the next video. And I get out of the bath and I say to my partner, babes, I think I'm trans. And they look at me and go, okay. And that was the end of that conversation. And I think this must must have been like in what, 2015, 2016-ish.
Okay.
When I was in my mid-20s at the time, and I started to try and find like more information. Like I needed to know more. Like, were there people like me in the world? This is like so wild that I'm now relating to an experience that I, for the longest time, thought I was the only one having that experience, and that it was a weird experience, but turns out that it wasn't. And so I then started watching all of these little docies, these films, these things. And while they were amazing for me, it was a little difficult because a lot of the content that I found was all international stuff. So a lot of content coming out of the United States, a lot of stuff in Australia, in the UK, but very little local South African trans stuff. And that was really isolating for me. And as a way to sort of navigate my own coming into my own identity, I came out very, very, very publicly. I came out on social media, and I then started blogging about it as a way to process it. And then after a while, it also became this thing of being able to give visibility to a narrative that I was struggling to find when I came out. And if, I don't know, another queer or trans person was also struggling with the things like I did, that
Right.
there'd be something that they could access that was local, that was familiar, that was comforting in some kind of way. And that just sort of, I guess, catapulted this entire thing. And now I'm me, apparently.
It sounds like it must have been actually a very difficult journey. I know there's as you speak about now here towards the end of what you've just said, that now you that person that's creating content for other people who feel that they are on the same journey as you were once on, but that you don't want them to feel as isolated. But if I could just go back a little bit, I mean, you talk about being isolated, you talk about it was so difficult. Just in terms of finding content in South Africa relating to this journey, that your personal experience, but how did the people around you react? You say you were in a relationship at that time. What were some of the ripple effects of you now discovering that I am trans?
I mean, it was difficult in a lot of ways, but it was also a very affirming and joyful experience. My partner that I was with at the time was incredibly supportive and really, really amazing. I'd like to think I'm like a good judge of character, so I tend to like pick people who are just by their nature like good people and intuitive people and compassionate people. So I've been very lucky in my life to be surrounded with friends who are that. And so I guess me coming out to my partner at the time, while it was hard, was also exciting in a particular kind of way. It was they were really, really supportive, and I don't think I've like gotten through those early years had it not been for them. So I'm really, really deeply grateful for that. That said, there were a lot of, I guess, difficult things that started coming up for me when I came out publicly around my identity, because suddenly what is happening now is that somebody needs to shift how they've perceived me for the longest time, right? And particularly like with old friends, with family, like when there's been, I guess, a history, a shared history between us, they've now got to like pivot and shift how they're engaging with me. And that was really difficult for some people. And I felt the burn of that. I lost a lot of friendships. I lost a lot of family members that I had to distance myself from, cut off completely, because it was just so unhealthy for me. And so those were some of the I guess, initial like coming out things that I had to deal with. It's also like one of those things that I continue to like deal with. I mean, you'll hear queer people say this all the time, that like coming out isn't like a single event, like you're constantly having to declare your identity to the world for you to be affirmed in it. And so that has remained true to my experience, that in some kind of way I'm always needing to, inverted commas, hate the word, but like disclose something about myself to somebody, about my identity. And that's a little weird and jarring. There were all kinds of other things that happened, some like deeply like traumatic things that that had happened to me subsequently to, coming out. And this is, I guess, an indication of the state of how trans people exist in the world at the moment, that we are often met with great hostility and great violence in a number of ways. That is sometimes really extremely difficult to deal with. And that's, I guess, an ongoing struggle for people like me.
Would you be willing to share with us, some of those traumatic experiences? If you're not comfortable, that's also fine.
I mean, I might not go into the specifics of it, right? But I can tell you that on a day-to-day, there are some levels of discrimination that I experience just by being me, like going to the shop sometimes. When I first started coming out, I wasn't as feminine presenting as I am now. And I was assaulted because of that, because I didn't fit a mold, or fit a way of behaving that other people expected of me. And it also then started raising other things in my childhood that had started, I guess, coming to the fore around how I had historically been perceived and then subsequently responded to in my behavior, right? So somebody treats me in a particular way, I then compensate my behavior in a particular way so as to avoid such treatment. And so there starts this, I guess, this cycle of deep psychological abuse, this cycle of internalized transphobia to a certain degree. While, not to sort of wash over like any of the major traumatic things that have happened to me over the course of my life. I think one of the things that for me has been one of the biggest hurdles, I think, was overcoming that internalized transphobia, that internalized homophobia. And what is that what does it mean to exist fully without all of that? Because I'd been living with that for the longest time. That's a lot of work to undo, particularly for me coming out that late. Right. Decades of behavior, decades of being one way, and having to unlearn all of that and reshape how I think about the world and how I think about myself and how I think about myself in relation to everyone else. I'm a person of particular privilege and a person of particular means, right? So I'm from a middle class background. I have access to a steady income. I have access to basic healthcare. For most people who are like me, they don't have that. They are often finding themselves in situations where their family and their friends are not supportive of who they are. They are finding themselves in places where they are being discriminated against, at their places of work where they can't work because of who they are. And because they can't work, they can't earn an income. And because they can't earn an income, they don't have access to healthcare. There's a lack of education. If there's suddenly this ripple of issues that start arising just as a result of the prejudice of somebody seeing somebody who's visibly trans and go, I'll treat you as subhuman. And that's really difficult for a lot of people.
I can imagine. And it also sounds like what you're describing is trauma upon trauma upon trauma. So what are some of the misconceptions that you find people actually have about transgendered people?
I think in general, people have a sort of a very instinctual response mechanism to things that are other to them, right? So we'll see something that is different and something that is foreign to us, and our initial response is we're gonna fight the thing, right? We're gonna this thing does not belong to our group. This thing is other. This thing is threatening. And it's often that space that I find a lot of people's perceptions, people's insecurities, the way that they then subsequently behave. It's usually that impetus where things are coming from. And so if you're factoring into people's, social systems, their belief systems into that, it also then starts feeding how they are, one, perceiving trans people, and two, how they are then acting toward them. These sort of these myths and these misconceptions that we're evil and we're demonic and we're coming for the children and there are layers upon layers upon layers of these weird little myths. And they're the same sort of things that people were saying about like gay people in the 70s, in the 80s, you know what I mean? Like it's this same cycle of like we've heard this before. That whenever there's like a group that is other that is coming into the sort of general pop, or when the general pop is like being made aware of this, everybody suddenly goes, ha, who are they? They're coming for us. And really, trans people are just like, they were just like other people, with regular human beings who were just trying to like, you know, go to the shop and make some dinner and chill with our people and do like nice things. Like we're not like malicious, you know what I mean? And so I find this prejudice and this stereotype and these misconceptions often coming from a place of unknowingness, of coming from a place of fear, for lack of a better phrase. And so often when I'm just being me, I'm often the only trans person that people know. And once they can like get over that hurdle, and we seem to have a lot fewer like issues. And so there's this humanizing thing that happens when the thing that was considered other is now something that's familiar, something that we can tangibly see, touch and feel and experience in a particular way. Suddenly it shifts how you think about stuff. And then, you know, now you've got to confront all of your prejudices and your things and be like, oh, was I problematic when I said this, or when I did that? And why am I behaving like this towards other people like this? And so I think this is also part of the greater thing that trans people are forcing a lot of people to confront their prejudices, is that it isn't just about the like accepting trans people. It's about an introspective thing. I think it's about it actually forces you to look at your own prejudice, your own traumas, your own experiences that you've had in your life, and rethink about how you've been thinking about them for the longest time. And that's the work, and that's the difficulty that a lot of people are having, because a lot of people aren't willing to put in the work. It's easier to just be like, yeah, it's fine, I'm just not going to think about it, and like, I don't care about them.
So in other words, I mean, what I'm hearing is, you know, saying that the best way to confront the biases and the prejudice that exists is to literally engage people in discussion and make them realize that at the end of the day, whether you're a trans person or however you choose to identify, you're still a person and you're just a normal human being, and there's no need for fear or to think that any person who chooses to identify differently to another person is a threat to the other person's existence.
Yeah, I mean, like, dialogue is such an important thing, right? It's how we communicate. It's how we exchange ideas. Like we wouldn't be where we are if we didn't communicate with one another. We wouldn't have societies. I mean, we're a social species, you know. And I think the more of that we can have. And it doesn't necessarily mean dialogue in like I have to sit down and listen to you actually physically speak, you know. It's dialoguing in a way that maybe it's somebody who's listening to this podcast. Maybe it's somebody who's seeing a queer experience in a film that they're watching. Those are these like degrees of familiarity that we start building, that starts cascading into spaces of, maybe I was being a little bit weird about how I've been feeling about trans people or queer people. And maybe it's not that threatening.
Indeed. Transgender people are also part of a community that is commonly referred to as key populations. And with that is this understanding that the health needs for key populations differ as compared to those that are outside of these population groups. What would you say are some of the health needs for transgendered people? And listening to what you're saying, you know, I feel that perhaps you might also allude to some of the mental health needs as well. So maybe, you know, to broaden that questions, what are some of the mental and physical health needs, that are needed specifically for transgendered people?
So I think a lot of like the needs of trans people are like tied to the ability to access basic human rights, right? So it's often the case that trans people can't receive or don't receive adequate healthcare because of the nature of the discrimination that they are facing when they are going to public healthcare facilities. If you're wanting to access private healthcare, that speaks to a whole situation around like your access to economics, right, or the level of economics. So to sort of like bring it back down to like the basics, the thing that I think like trans people desperately need is just access to basic healthcare. There are so many people that I know who will not go to the doctor, who will put off going to the clinic until they are like on their last, because they are trying to avoid the complication of having to engage with that discrimination. And so that's one thing that needs to be done, right? There's a social education, there's a thing that needs to happen around providing safe spaces for trans people to access healthcare in a basic way, right? There are obviously like specific needs that are like coming out of like the trans community, like they are for like, different population groups. And one of that is access to gender affirming healthcare, where in South Africa there are, I think, 2 state institutions, only 2 that provide this. And because of that, the system is overloaded. The healthcare system in South Africa is already overloaded and overburdened in and of itself. And now we only have 2 facilities who are providing these gender affirming healthcare services to trans people. So we need more of that of that gender affirming healthcare services that are made available. There are also like organizations and various sort of like bodies who are attempting to fill the gap. But RHI is one of them. There are a number of like private clinics as well who have now started doing consultations for gender affirming healthcare, which is incredible. But we need more of that. We really, really do need more of that. Our access to gender affirming healthcare is directly tied to our mental and emotional and physical well-being in the world. But it is often a space of not being able to see yourself reflected in the mirror as you see yourself, and that is huge. To feel like you're walking around in a body that's alien and unfamiliar and deeply uncomfortable. And so gender affirming healthcare provides a way to sort of like fit that process. Linking to that is the mental health and wellness support. I think for trans people specifically, those conversations around what their mental health support looks like needs to be also brought into that sort of broader conversation, because it is sometimes extraordinarily difficult to, go and talk to a therapist who is deeply homophobic. Like, that doesn't really serve your mental wellness at all. So there are all sorts of measures and things that need to be developed, that need to be put in place, so that when somebody who's queer or when somebody who is trans wants to access a particular service that is their basic human right, that they can do so in a space that is safe, in a space that is inclusive, and a place that's not going to do further harm to them.
What would you say are some of the measures that need to be taken in South Africa to ensure that these services that you've just talked about are more accessible to transgender?
I think there are a number of policy interventions that we can create here and there. There are sort of structures that we can build into our existing institutions. But to sort of take it a step back, I think a large part of this conversation that we're having now around what does that access look like starts from a very basic place, and that is a space to bridge that gap of unfamiliarity, which is a space of education. So it requires us to integrate these diverse identities and the needs of diverse people into everything that we do. So there's got to be education that's happening within the Department of Health, right? And once they're sort of educated on what are the needs of this population, it then filters down to them going, okay, maybe we need to produce certain policy in certain aspects. Maybe we need to provide a particular service in a particular way. If this is in the space of corrections, maybe they also need to think about what are the conditions under which inmates are living. What does that look like in that space? What does it look like in the education sector? Do we need to introduce sort of this level of education at a schooling level, so that when those people graduate, that they are now entering into a job market, into a workspace where they are also now auditors and actors of accountability for the mechanisms around them to make sure that those spaces are safe, not just for trans people. This is like for every group. I know we're having a particular conversation around, like trans identity specifically, right. But what does it also then look like to have people with disabilities, people who are deaf, people who are blind? Like, it's all of the nuance in these conversations that we often, when we think about providing services in a particular way, it's often about like for the majority. And I get that. That makes absolute sense, that most of our resources are diverted for the majority. But there are so many of us who are not part of that majority, who have different needs. And our needs are just as important as the needs of the majority of the population. And so I think it's important to have those bits of education integrated in every level of our society around what does it mean to be somebody who is other in the world, and what does it look like to give them dignity in a particular way.
Is that where your content on YouTube is aiming to achieve as well? To promote that inclusivity, that diversity, to create and foster those dialogues, to challenge stigma, discrimination, prejudice, bias, to encourage people to communicate and interact and not fear what is other, but to also push at the same time an understanding to advocate for policy reform and so on?
I think I started that YouTube channel as a mechanism to do all of the things that you just said. I think, when people talk about like visibility, I mean, it's often like, very synonymous with like queer people in terms of like media work, like what does the visibility for somebody look like in this space? I think the thing about visibility, that it isn't just about being seen. Being somebody who is a regular person, who's doing regular things, who's having conversations about regular stuff, is the kind of narrative work that starts building conversation. I have avoided to a large degree preaching about things, like being explicitly like advocating with trans rights and going, we need this policy and we need this and this. Trans people are vulnerable in this way, protect them from violence here. Like I purposefully omitted doing that because that's not the kind of work that I am invested in. There are lots of other people who are doing that work, and that work is deeply important. But I think for me and my work, and particularly the visibility work on YouTube, I think it is about building those bridges, building those conversations. It's about like seeing yourself reflected in somebody who is, that you would have never thought, I can totally relate to this person, but they're so different from me. And it's these little threads of like commonality that we start like weaving between one another. And then all of a sudden, when somebody, I don't know, hypothetically is going to vote, maybe, because they now know somebody who's trans, maybe they'll rethink about voting for somebody who's homophobic or maybe xenophobic, or, it's those kind of like intangibles that is very difficult to quantify on we got X policy passed.
Right.
The thing that I think we're trying to do, or at least what I'm hoping that the channel is doing, it's starting to like build those little connections.
Exactly. I think, when we talk about advocacy and we talk about changing perceptions and mindset, or influencing those change, it's not something that you can measure overnight and say, I've changed 5 people's minds or views. It's something you only see over the course of time. And you've been doing this. Exactly. You've been doing this over the course of time. And do you feel optimistic that there is a positive change in South African communities, towards more acceptance, inclusivity, understanding, and perhaps even, if I can go as far as to say, advocating, where you have people who do not identify within the LGBTIQ plus space advocating for those rights? Are we seeing that shift in South Africa, in your opinion, of course?
I think there's been like a very definite shift in how trans people have been spoken about, like, in various spaces. I don't know if it's like a necessarily, if it equals like a shift in, like, if it's a shift towards positivity. But what I do know is that if I look at what the landscape looks like now versus 10 years ago, just on a level of language, historically we had been using very profoundly discriminatory language to describe trans people. And now we're at a space where we recognize that there's a particular type of dignity that we have to give to people. And so our language is more appropriate now. I think while we might see very, very, very slow progress with policy, while we might see very, very slow progress in inverted commas, the sort of like social acceptance of like trans people in the broader society, while we might be very, very slow to that, the thing that we can visibly see is how people are talking about queer people, how people are talking about trans people, what is the language that they are using. And that shift to a more dignified language, I think, is a shift to giving dignity in a number of other ways to queer and trans people.
I think also perhaps, that maybe as we see more people becoming comfortable with being openly transgendered, also kind of gives us an indication of where we are at as a country and the space that we've created for them to feel comfortable enough, although stigma and discrimination continues to exist. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think I would. I think the fact that we are having more and more people now feeling more comfortable saying that they're trans is indicative of the space being a little bit more okay to be able to do that. This is also not to say necessarily that, now more people are becoming trans, because that's not really true. I mean,
Exactly.
we've existed for like forever. But I think the space is now safer for people to go, actually, I'm trans and I want to say that out loud and I deserve my human dignity. And I think people are demanding that. And I think that's a really, really good thing.
Zoey, indeed, there's still a lot of work that we need to do to challenge the stigma and discrimination that continues to exist. But you are correct in saying that there has been a shift in terminology, in dialogues, in spaces to include transgender and people of key populations as well. On this particular Pride Month, as we chat to you, what would you say is your fundamental message, or what would you say is your fundamental message for Pride, for people living as trans, for people who are transgendered, for people that form part of the LGBTIQ plus community?
Pride Month is such a weird, it's such a weird space because suddenly we have like all of this, like, like this pro-queer things, like all the ads are pro-queer and like people trying to sell us all the things, and like everybody for like this month is like, yay. And so I always had this like weird relationship with Pride Month. And then a lot of people like queer people that I've spoken to are also like, yeah, you know what, like this is like the crazy time of the year, Pride Month, June. And I guess my focus is more about what happens outside Pride Month, like with all of these like days that we celebrate, these commemorative days, when it's Women's Month, what happens to women outside of that month? And so that's the challenge for me, I think, for queer people. I think for like, I would say to like all the non-queer, like people who aren't part of the queer community, is like you have to ask yourself, like, what are you doing outside of that? When queer people are not being celebrated, what are you doing? It's always in the moments when nobody's looking that is the test of the character. And so I would urge people to have a look at that, to reflect on that. And what does that mean to be an ally? What does it mean to give dignity to everyone, even when it's not Pride Month?
Zoey, I'm going to end it here, and I want to say thank you very much for the time and for sharing your personal experience with us of living as a transgendered person and your journey with regards to how your identity has changed and taking us on this experience with us. So thank you very much, and we wish you all of the best, and we hope that we can continue chatting with you, and things do continue to change more positively for people that form part of the LGBTIQ+ community. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
That was Zoey Black, a South Africa transgender activist and filmmaker, using her platform to challenge stigma, fear, and discrimination towards people of the LGBTIQ+ community. Should you be interested in her content, give her channel on YouTube, Zoey Black, a view. As we celebrate Pride Month, let's take a moment to reflect on the progress made and the work still needed to ensure equality and acceptance for all. As Zoey said, what we do in Pride Month matters, but it's how we follow through beyond that is the true test of our characters. From the UNAIDS South Africa team, thank you for listening. Feel free to give us a follow and comment on our UNAIDS South Africa platforms on Instagram, Facebook, and X.